Friends, welcome back to the Rachel LaForce Show for all things comedy, culture, and consciousness. You're tuned in. This episode, you guys, did I have a conversation with a full-on PhD? Yes, I did. Today's guest is Joshua Clarkson. He has a PhD in both social psychology, say it again, social psychology, she stuck the landing, and then he has another PhD in marketing. So he focuses all on consumer, he's a consumer psychologist. I can't even say it, it's so above my pay grade. But he specializes in self-control, persuasion, and social influence. You guys, this conversation, I wanted to read that directly, and I still messed it up, but you know what I mean? Such as you know what show you're listening to. This conversation is so dense and wonderful, and I just so appreciate, that he spoke with me as though, I'm on his level, and we just had this really beautiful conversation of really talking about marketing, culture, self-control, self-improvement, and just the way in which all of that is even marketed to us. And he really spoke to us through this academic lens, and I was speaking through a very intuitive lens. And it is just such an absolute dream conversation. I'm so grateful that Josh came on the show. And that's it. Take a listen. It's awesome. All right. Love you, mean it.
Time, weather, and highways.
How do you know Ross?
So my brother went to college with him and up in Chicago. And at the same time I was in grad school at Indiana University, okay. So I got up to Chicago quite a bit, and I got to meet Ross and his family, and they're absolutely wonderful, absolutely wonderful people. So, he's amazing. He's amazing. Yes.
Oh my gosh.
Is that where you know him out of curiosity?
Yeah,
through your time there?
Great question. If I was okay, great, thanks for letting me know, and then I just move on. So I did comedy in Chicago. So
yep,
I
saw that.
What I call a stage crush on Ross for so long, because I was this guy, on stage, I was just so great. And that was long before I knew him personally. He was on a really great improv team. And then, it was kind of trickled in the same circles. And then we ended up living in the same building before him.
Oh, no way.
Before Jenny moved back down.
Yep.
So there was 6 or 7 of us from Second City that all lived in this building in Hollywood.
Oh, wow.
And so we made buddies then. And then just, I think through kind of similar life stuff and starting podcasts and kind of doing some coaching stuff. And he's got 2 boys. We have 2 boys. So it's really nice because him and Jenny came and visited a couple months ago. So.
Oh, yeah. Oh, nice. Yeah, they're great, and it seems like a wonderful family. The whole improv scene, and the stage presence and the stage crush. You're not alone in that, I think. It's just so magnetic.
It's so fun. So okay, well, now I got a crush on you. Can I tell you? First of all, 2 PhDs. How does one have time? That's phenomenal. So you have a PhD in marketing and a PhD in social psychology.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Now, so tell me everything of so here's kind of a couple of things. As you can tell, I like to talk. I'm very effervescent. So feel no need to answer every single thing. We'll go where we go. But I'm just so curious because I also feel what the work that you're doing, and I know you've published a bunch of articles, and I'm really excited to hear later as we chat kind of what is next for Josh.
Mm-hmm.
What are you going to kind of bring our way? But it's so timely, I think, the work in which you're doing, which is how are we attracted to certain things? Why are we attracted to certain things? And you have 3 main kind of concentration, right, within what it is that you study.
Exactly.
So
yes.
Tell us a little bit about that. Were 2 PhDs in the bag? Did you get one and then you're I got to go for another one?
Yeah, it's a good story. Yeah, so first of all, my main areas, they probably seem like very, very separate. It's of areas of research and expertise is self-control, and then persuasion and social influence. And maybe by the end of this, you'll get a sense of how I actually view all those as very, very similar.
Oh, I'm with you. That's why I want to hear from you, because I was like, oh, what a magician. Okay, so tell me.
Well, so one thing I should say is, so my job, I'm an academic, and what I thought might be kind of interesting is like I don't know, I don't think I knew that my job actually existed, especially like as a kid or even in college. I don't think a lot of individuals know, myself included at the time. Like, we understand the teaching side, but this whole idea of research and sort of academic learning, I think, is a bit of a mystery. And when I was in graduate school, I had gotten a master's in psychology. I was very fascinated in psychology, very fascinated just the mind works. And there's a lot of different areas in psychology. So you have like developmental psychology, how do people develop from like young to old, and the different processes that occur. There's clinical psychology, which most people I think are pretty familiar with. Obviously, counseling is another one. But then there's these areas called like social and cognitive psychology. And they're really these areas that focus on some of the fundamental processes for how we think and how we behave. So like areas like stereotyping and prejudice, these are big areas. Group dynamics. What's fascinating is if you want to apply for like the FBI or CIA, these are areas they really value, because they help you understand things like, why do cults form, and why do you have authoritarian regimes? And so the implications are there. But so anyway, I was able to get into after my master's, I was able to get into a PhD program in social and cognitive psychology at Indiana University. And there I was able to work on this idea of persuasion. Like, why do we change? Well, we all have beliefs. A lot of your podcast seems to really focus on this idea of trying to change and adapt, right? And yet it can be very difficult at times. Other times it can be very easy. Like I can be talked into seeing like pretty much any movie. But when it comes to like certain restaurants, I am very much like, no, I'm not trying that. I'm not right. So it's kind of right. And so I spent 4 years at Indiana University, a wonderful place. But I was struggling because a lot of that research is very what we call basic research. And I had several faculty friends. My advisor actually while I was in Indiana, he had actually gotten a position in the marketing department at Stanford University in their graduate business school. And I kind of started opening up my mind to the possibility that, well, maybe there is sort of, maybe it's not just all basic research. Maybe there is a way to sort of apply and relate some of this stuff. Now, my family, they all work in small businesses. I don't come from a family of academics. And so again, the idea of trying to do research that wasn't just basic, but also connected and had very clear practical relevance, to me, I found fascinating. And so, yeah, I decided to, I got a really wonderful opportunity to go back to school. I was still in school, but to go to another program in marketing and at the University of Florida, which was absolutely wonderful. It was a little tough though. It was tough going from getting a PhD and finishing to then starting back over again. That was tough and a little bit humbling. But it was good.
And just going from Indiana to Florida, two very different worlds.
Very different. Yes.
And like you have like the culture shock and then going back.
Big time.
I feel like I've done that, just sharing this as like connecting to your story, where it's like, yeah, there's been many times where there's kind of this, like, for me, especially right now, this like self-recreation. So although I'm not like applied where like I'm showing up to class, like me even starting this podcast was, okay, me starting my class. Like I have a PhD in comedy. Now I'm like, I want to go get a PhD in what I identify as like kind of like spiritual and like societal wellness. Like, how do we go from, which is what I'm so intrigued about your work, where it's like, especially that, like connectiveness, where it's like, okay, well, if we can go out and find other ways to like get this research, isn't there other ways that it could be applied to then we could kind of come back to these spaces, whether academic or otherwise, and be able to put them into practice and see what we can do. And that's just what I'm so fascinated by.
And I love what you said, because this idea of recreation, I don't like lean into it. Like, we all do it. It's not a bad thing. And the idea that we're constant and continuing to learn, I think, is something that should be celebrated, right? I think it's a real positive, and it takes courage. You're going to put yourself out there. You're going to try to do these things. Like, I'll be candid with you. I was doing just fine in social psychology. It was a big culture shock going into a business school. I had never taken a business school in my life, and now I'm in a business school. I wasn't brought up in sort of that business school mentality in my own education. It was very much arts and science, and very much not seeing the business side of things. But that was sort of the challenge. The challenge is, if I can create something, then I've been able to merge these two areas to come up with essentially consumer psychology, which to me is fascinating. And I love this sort of space that I'm in, because I really get to pull from both worlds, which is fun for me. I mean, I get to ask a lot of fun questions. The research questions I get to do, it's opened a lot of doors that I'm not saying I wouldn't have been able to do if I had just stayed in psychology, but it certainly made it a lot easier for me to do so. And I do think that recreation has been super important.
Well, and I'm sure that also, you obviously, Josh is a person you have of many value, but within the like a work marketplace, you're going to be able to speak to what you can speak about. Just opens up. Not only is it like very impressive, oh, this guy has 2 PhDs, but to me, where it's like both of those lenses are very much the same, because the way in which we're being marketed all of the time is through psychology. What's going to get somebody 100%. To buy something? What's going to get somebody to move from like being a Volvo driver to driving a Mercedes? Like, all of that is about emotion, which is rooted in how do people think, how do people act, and then you'll know how people buy, right?
And what's fascinating, so what got me interested in psychology way, way back in the day, I was sitting in a class. Is a class called Personality Psychology. And basically it was sort of just talking about what are some of the fundamental differences in people. And there's this idea of that some people like to really think a lot about certain things, and other people, they just don't like to do that a lot. And so they call this thing need for cognition, and some people are very high and some people are very low. And obviously you can kind of flip flop, but there's kind of this dispositional idea, right? And what's fascinating to me is that was one of the key variables that got me interested in this whole area of psychology. Well, fast forward 10, 15 years later, that idea is so fundamental to marketing. It is just so critical to understand that there are going to be some people that you've got to appeal to their analytical side in some way, in some shape. And there's a different route, and there's a whole different set of strategies you want to use if you're trying to reach these individuals and these consumers relative to individuals who, for instance, may not want to put a lot of thought or energy or time into, sort of a lot of these decisions. And I should note, like, a lot of decisions that we make on a day-to-day basis, like if you go to the store, for instance, most of them are going to be these low effort, types of decisions. And you are so right. Affect matters so much in this. And to be able to have at least some understanding of it, and also to have the resources to, if I don't understand something, to be able to test it and try to understand it. I mean, that's fun. I mean, it really is fun, because you really get a sense of, to me, it all comes back to, I should say this up front. I am not, I've never been driven by the financial aspects of it. It's academic. So for me, what's fascinating is understanding why we do what we do, why we like certain things that we like. And that, to me, I think is what drives a lot of these research questions, which makes it fun.
I have so many thoughts. Oh my gosh, so many thoughts. I'm going to say them out loud, so then that way maybe I'll remember to come back to them. One, which is I'm interested in, within the research and things that you've done, how do you, and maybe this isn't language that you identify, but meaning like, do you feel like the majority of the persuasion and these things that you're studying are being used for like bad or for greed? Or do you feel like a lot of the persuasion is getting people to, I mean, there's so much persuasion within like the wellness industry, right?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
There's so much in that too. We've just been like, look at the, same thing
Oh,
with like
yes.
green products. Now you just say it's green. Nobody's going to check the label. Like there's all of those things, right? Then that goes into litigation. If you don't have, we all know this, right? To sell
Yes.
something, any major company is going to do and say whatever they need to do to get it in
Exactly.
So there's that aspect I would love, maybe we could chat about, but I'm curious of like, what do you feel is like one of the things that's either where it was solidified for you? Like you had this thought of like, this is why people struggle to change, or this is how you persuade people, and you weren't sure. And then through like the basic research and the application of these things, you're like, I was right. Or what did you find? And you're like, that's so surprising that is like that you had overlooked that concept of the human psyche.
Oh, so first of all, those are all great questions. Just to plant the seed to come back to it later, this sort of one of the new areas I've been moving into is the self-improvement domain, where it is so unregulated. And there is a lot of, I'll say curious tactics. How about that? I'll say curious tactics that are used in these domains. And I'm more than happy to come back to that because this is a fun space that I'm actually like working in the moment, which is very, very fun.
No, well, and we will come back to it. I think that's what we'll probably end on, because that's such a big kind of just whopper of a conversation. But when you say curious, because you are in the field, so you're looking at these from an unemotional place. But if I or other people that are steeped in their emotions, would it be fair for them to say like charlatan tactics? Is that kind of
exactly? Yes. Okay. So, and I could give you a good example of maybe something that I would view as sort of questionable, and maybe something that I actually don't think is questionable, but just interesting. And so something that might be questionable, or that I would consider questionable, is so a lot of self-improvement products, and there are niches, and you're going to know exactly the areas I'm talking about. They promote this idea of once you start it, you have a fear of never stopping it. So if you think of anything like let's take a lotion that you use to reduce aging. Well, the moment I get you using that, then there's this fear that, well, if I stop, I'm going to get worse. And you might not even think the product's working very well. But at that point, now we have this fear that's driving our purchase behavior. And that is something I don't find very ethical at the end of the day, if that's being done directly, right?
No, because you're selling it on fear. And here's my other thing. I think, and this is like where, as my reach and value in the kind of like overall space, corporate space grows, where I really want to go into rooms, and I'm a little bit of a bulldog on this, of like, I actually would argue that you could absolutely sell just as much as you are, if not more, by reducing those tactics and replacing them with something where it's like, you should just have this because it's of value and it adds value to your life. Because people are going to walk away. Like the thing I'm the most, I have some bits about this in my stand-up I'm working on right now, is like the placebo effect.
Yes.
Where because people are always like, well, all these things you did, LaForce, to like change your life, like, do they really work, this or that? I'm like, does it matter? Drinking didn't work either. Like,
it's true.
Placebo. Like, you get to choose, But yeah, so continue on. Yeah.
No, but that's so true. And so much of that is in your head, and that you're creating this. And there's an element to this that I don't think is bad, in the sense that if a company is marketing something that makes the person feel better about themselves, then great. Like, that's great.
Yes.
But using that or using that as almost like, just a hook that gets connected in them, and now you're preying off of fears, I think can be really, sort of difficult, like I said, to sort of evaluate. And I agree with you. I don't think many like companies, real companies, you don't need it if you have, because it really should be about the value. No, another example of this that I think is just sort of curious. And I have a grad student who is he's driving this project, and it's so fascinating to me, but it's all about what we call pain promotions. So there's this whole industry in the fitness industry, there's this whole wing or lever that focuses on it's got to burn. It has to be painful. And in this case, there's nothing duplicitous. At least I should say this. It seems as if there's nothing duplicitous. But it's this idea of, okay, well, if you have, a workout class that you could go to, and one is just sort of a normal workout class, and the other one is like a cardio burn, who's more likely to go to that? Why are they more likely to go to it? And why simply is saying something like, this is going to be painful, why is that more attractive to certain people, right? And so that's one of the spaces that we're in right now, which is fascinating to me.
Well, and that stuff is so fascinating to me too, because like through a spiritual lens, for me, I'm like, well, there's a couple of reasons. One, people like to punish themselves.
Yes, they do.
If we're not interested in looking at our shame, why don't I feel a value? We punish ourselves all the time. Even not knowing that's what we're doing. Like me having a third IPA on a school night, quote unquote, and I didn't need that, and they're 12% alcohol. Punish myself, right? Like,
yes.
Counting
there's a purifying benefit. There's some people perceive that, right, as which again, it's there. You're right. That is really, really funny.
There's all ways. And then I think, because then that ties into like just diet culture in general. Obviously, I know that there's a lot of pressure on men as well. It's been interesting. Like I've been married almost 3 years, and like so really being in like such an intimate space with my husband where like the more things that I shared, he's like, yeah, well, like, no, this is something that's been said to me, or like this is something. So I don't mean to not address that, but just obviously my lens is as being a woman. But yeah, where it's like, oh, burn or cut calories, like, and then the way in which we've changed language where it's not fat free anymore, but now it's like de-bloat, it'll de-bloat you. Like if you just told me that we're having such a big discussion around gut health, which I believe gut health is I'm here for all of it. I've done a lot of healing of that myself, but I also think that there's a very slippery slope with that language, because it's like, well, that's just orthorexia in a different label. Like that's all you're doing. Is because if you can't solve it, then it's okay that you're doing this thing over and over again because, oh, I have allergy, or, oh, I have this thing. Well, then it's not a problem. So that's also that realm of punishment. So it's so deeply ingrained in us that I would think, if I'm being generous, even the people that like are using these quote unquote curious tactics are not even online to realize how destructive those tactics are. Right.
Exactly. And one of the areas that we, it's definitely even more future from what we're doing right now, but one of the areas that I've already seen where I think this would have very big implications is in this idea of recovery. So the idea that, well, you can push yourself and you can push yourself and you can push yourself. And look, as with anything, there's always going to be pros and cons and benefits. Like most things, like take a little bit of truth with almost anything and you can take something from it. So sure, getting yourself out of your comfort zone is important, right? We know that. Trying new restaurants, challenges are good. And if you actually, I can chat with you a little bit later about some of this other new space that I've in, which is in sort of these extreme unattainable goals, which I can talk about in sort of a counterintuitive way, which might be kind of fun. So again, I'm not saying that challenging yourself is bad. I'm actually saying in many instances, this actually can be really good, but the constant challenging of yourself, it's going to wear you down. And it just depends on your goals and what you're trying to do, but the implications this has for recovery and even our beliefs about recovery. Should I take a rest day? And you'd be like, well, of course you should. But how do I structure that? Because we have this idea of momentum, right? Well, if I work out today, I have to work out tomorrow. And if I work out, and it can become very obsessive, right?
Well, and again, all of like through this spiritual lens is also, and when I say spiritual, I don't mean like Sanskrit yoga retreat. I just mean like through being human and the things that like we don't highlight, yet we all experience. That's what I think the most spiritual things are. When you're looking at somebody who looks nothing like you and you tell a story about something that happened in your life and you go, they're like, oh, that's weird. I had something similar, even if the details are completely different. Those to me are the spiritual threads.
Very much so.
And so when you share something like that, that's just what absolutely lights me up, because I'm like, that is such a huge thing, which is like, we're so focused on the external that it's not even, I think, some of it is like, I can't rest because I don't know what to do with myself. If I don't know how to feel that time, I'm uncomfortable. And I do this for living, and I feel that way. Like, I get it. Again, I have a bit in my stand-up where I'm like, you know, I understand now why most people choose to keep drinking, because once I quit drinking, I had more memberships that I knew what to do with. You know, I'm going to yoga, I have to do meditation, and then I've got
need something to do. Yeah.
And so it's like, okay, then what's the alternative? You know, when you get in these cycles of like, I'm healing, this is my goal, I'm leveling up.
Yes.
I think it's really dangerous territory, because I also think the thing that's the most interesting and the most pure, which is why I love doing this podcast, is like, tell me the thing that's unique about you. Like, that's why when Rob sent you to me, and I was like, oh, this guy's clearly like super curious. And, you know, like, there's got to be some element of the intrigue of like, okay, I think we could do better, right? Like, or maybe this is not the case, but maybe you were like, oh, now I can figure out more evil tactics. So like, obviously,
no, right? I mean, it's
not
there.
Yeah, I love that.
Well, one point that you might find interesting is that it kind of goes with what you were just saying as well. Where pain or painful experiences, where the you know, hot yoga retreat, you know, could actually be positive. You might find this interesting. There is some research that shows that for transformative experiences, if you're with others, so it's something that's shared, that there's that, without being kind of too cliche, pain bonds people super, super closely. And so if you are to experience something where you're going through something, but you're doing it with others, one of the big benefits of that is some sort of transformational moment is you will get closer with those individuals you are with, and that is taught about very transformationally. Yes.
No. Sorry. I cut you off. So I want to hear that last part, but that's also why, right? Because I'm also looking at all of these things where I don't think that the world is inherently like good or bad, but everything is on a spectrum. And it's like, well, those are also the same things that happen in a cult, right? Where like, if everybody else here thinks that this is normal, then I must need to catch up because I'm the one that's having feelings about this. So it is really interesting.
Yeah. So what's fascinating too, I am fascinated by the idea of cults, mostly because, from an academic lens, mostly because there are aspects to cults that are, it's the subversiveness. These are the things that are really important to delineate. But if you remove a lot of that, like, there are reasons people are in cults that can be seen as very logical, or at least at the time, right? And you think about some of these things, and again, the point is the subversiveness to it. That's the dangerous part of it. But it doesn't mean that, you know, groups coming together, that share similar beliefs. I mean, running clubs are that way, you know, like date nights. There's things that we all do that sort of fit into this. Having those similar interests, being able to grow together. These are wonderful things to be able to do. Being careful that it is, you know, however you want to think about it, that the reason you're doing it, the foundation matters, I think is really, really, really important, because that's how you can distinguish it from, say, something that maybe is a bit more ambiguous and starts, you know, leading you down a different route. And as an aside, that's one way to really distinguish. That's two different goals can lead you to two different ways you're being persuaded. And that's very, 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 we see that a lot.
Well, can I talk about that again? It's just like reframing. People come to me and they're like, I feel really stuck. And I'm like, do you feel really stuck, or you know what to do and you're just not ready to go there?
Yes.
Because that's different. And because I was like,
such a good example,
you know, where it's just, there's so many things like that, where it's like, I think there's just also a different way and a perspective of looking at something. So yeah, we could, you know, even as simple as, oh, is something curious, or is something, you know, like sharp behavior, it's the same thing. And just capping that off on cults, I feel like the real distinction is like, are you able to question the authority? And when you're able to question the authority, because sometimes, and this will take us down a totally different route, we don't have to go there, but like even within American politics, and we get to that place where even if something, we think that we're chanting in the idea of good, but if you remove any ability to have nuanced conversations,
Yes.
Which we're seeing that a lot across the board, I was like, that's a problem. Like, we should always be able to like have the ability to like question and ask, and like, you know, that's so much of, I do, a lot of my work is focused on community gathering and connection, because I very much feel that way of like, I think a lot of the reason we all feel so lost and we're chasing these burn boot camps and, you know, these like high-end elite dating apps, because if the more elite it is, maybe then I'll find my person, or like all of these things that are shrouded where it's like, you really just want to look at somebody and be like, yeah, I feel that way too. Like, I'm like, think
connect.
How, like, that's such a, like, that should not be such a radical. Where do we get to this place that we're so vulnerable and scared? Like, I did an episode not that long ago, and there were all these tech things that were going wrong and all this stuff, and I was feeling embarrassed. And I was like, man, as it's going on, I'm like, I'm not connecting with this person because I'm focused on myself and this embarrassment. I'm like, why don't you just name it? It's not that big of a deal. It doesn't take away from your worth to go, yeah, I'm a little embarrassed right now. But like, you know, where it's like, it's not saying you're an absolute sham, you're an idiot, nobody likes you. It's literally just going, oh, I thought this was going to go a different way, and that's a bummer. And so I think when we feel permission in groups from other people, that that's okay to say, and have somebody go, yeah, I still think you're boss, you know, like, totally cool, but like something went weird for a second, you know. And I think
it's amazing at how, and I mean this, it is amazing at how a few years, whether it be middle school, high school, both, or whatever, that is so formative for the rest of our life in terms of how we think and evaluate ourselves in interactions. Because in those years, vulnerability is the kiss of death. You don't want to share any of this. I'm not a developmental psychologist, but experientially, I think we all can agree. This is a time where you want to be cool. You want to fit in. These needs for belongingness matter so much more than these needs for uniqueness. And hopefully, you know, we all grow out of that in some ways and this and that. But that idea of expressing vulnerability is so tough, but it goes back to kind of what we were just saying about pain. The mechanism is actually the same, assuming it's in the right context. You know, I'm not talking oversharing but if you're talking with friends, and not just a random stranger, you have breakthroughs, you bond. And in fact, you could actually argue that by sharing part of yourself, that is how you're going to have closer connections. It's very hard to have close connections and never give of yourself in those ways. It is very, very difficult. I did want to say, because I agree, I don't typically like to go down this route, but I do think that you might find this interesting in terms of the political spectrum. And this might be interesting for people listening to this as well. It's influenced me significantly. So we've seen a big shift. If you take this distinction between sort of like just general assumptions versus nuanced arguments. At some point, what has happened? So I've done some research in political ideology. I have a couple of papers on these topics, but I'm actually not very interested in the political side of it, and I mean that from an academic perspective, right? So in terms of studying it, are there certain characteristics or traits that lead people to maybe lean more conservatively or lean more liberally? And then might those traits lead to different sort of outcomes that sort of shape sort of their health, livelihood, and well-being, right? That's sort of what I've been interested in. And one of the, so we look at things like free will beliefs, we look at things like cognitive flexibility, and we look at things like self-control, persistence, and these types of outcomes. But what more to your point, what I think is sort of interesting is that we've been seeing a ton of uptick in research over the past decade in political ideology. And what one interpretation that I will lend to the research right now is we're starting to see that maybe these distinctions that we're looking at between conservative and liberal are actually better understood, at least in this day and age right now, as between extreme and moderate opinions. And so if someone is focusing on a very simple narrative, what do we know? Well, we know that people who typically have more extreme beliefs and ideologies, they typically tend to gravitate more towards simpler narratives, whereas people who are moderate typically tend to see gray in things. And the interesting thing about that is what that might suggest is that actually political party affiliation might not be as relevant as just how extreme you are. So in other words, there might actually be a lot more commonality in conservative and liberals. It's more about whether you're extreme liberal and extreme conservative versus moderate liberal, moderate conservative, that there's actually more similarity than dissimilarity, especially lately, meaning, the past, 5 years or so. We've seen this where like the polarization has stretched further, but if you talk to most people and you see a lot of polls, there's still so much commonality more in the middle. So just an interesting perspective. When I hear people say something like, well, liberals are more likely or conservatives are more likely, I immediately think, is that the case, or is it just people with extreme ideologies versus people with more moderate ideologies? Because we do see that difference.
Yes. And then I would also, and again, I'm speaking very generally, it's like anytime you get those really extreme, loud voices on either side, you're also, I'm not a clinical psychologist, but you're also looking at a myriad of personality disorders. What has driven somebody to want to be the loudest person in the room?
Exactly.
What has, like, especially, with any of like big ticket items, LGBT, race relations, any of these really big, abortion, everybody has really high feelings about it. I'm like, a lot of the people that these things have affected the most, a lot of those people are a lot closer to the middle. So that's something to always pay attention to as well.
Point.
Not that where I'm like, oh, it's interesting that person is the one that's screaming about this thing, where I'm like, I know that's probably never touched their sphere.
Exactly.
Or has that radical behavior become, don't see me, don't see me, don't see me. Right. Which is a lot of times why we very sadly, we see something where, somebody who was like, gays are going to hell. And then you find out that, they were meeting teenage boys, in bathroom. And I don't even, there used to be something that I would like make fun of, and I'd be like, oh, how, hypocritical. And now I'm like, oh no, so sad that somebody was like, in that position. So it's always interesting. I always remind people of that. And the same thing with like coaching, wellness, all of this self-improvement. Anybody who is promising you something, that should be the red flag. Products too.
Big time. Really great. This helped me see it. This is, I had I had messed up my ankle, just running, and I'd messed up pretty badly. And a buddy recommended I go to get physical therapy, and he had a connection, put me in touch with the guy. I went there, and it was like 12 weeks, and I did everything, and it was amazing. But the whole plan was I wasn't designed to be a lifelong, client there. It was such an interesting shift. And when you think about self-improvement in general, you can always be trying to grow in different ways. That's the positive of self-improvement. The negative of self-improvement is all the self-critique and the fact that you're just facilitating maybe a negative or unhealthy self-image. But one way to sort of have to give yourself maybe a bit of a check is this idea of how, and does that make sense? This distinction, like it could be positive or negative?
Oh, completely.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that's even, so my business and what I do and my passions have been, they're all still very much the same, but slowly as I'm figuring out kind of like what pockets I want to be in. And so I was offering these because I was just taking a coaching or mentorship model from the ones that exist. And then, people who were signing up for like 3 and 6 month memberships, and 2 sessions in my mind, I'm going, I don't know what else I can help this person with.
Exactly.
Not because I am not of value to these people. And I always tell people this, I'm like, I'm going to work myself out of money because I'm really good at what I do. So hopefully you're going to come and meet with me for 90 minutes. And I'm intuitively going to go, have you looked at this thing? And they're going to go, how in the world did you see that? And I'll go, that's why you paid me. And then, I'm going to give you a roadmap of action steps. I shouldn't see you for 6 months because what I'm giving you should be of such value that you've got many moons to go before you come back and you're like, I'm ready for the next thing.
Exactly. Right? And that's exactly what because it really is, it's a check. And there may be instances where like my ankle, maybe there's a knee issue or maybe there's a hip issue and that's leading to it. But it shouldn't be perpetual. And if you want to say, well, you want to give them the, sure, maybe give us leniency there. At least there should be a evolving goal in some way, but I shouldn't be working on one thing for the rest of my life without there being a clear objective as to what we're trying to do, essentially.
Absolutely. Well, and I love your work too, because I find all these things fascinating, right? And I think in many ways I'm looking at a lot of the same things. I'm just looking through them through a different lens.
Very much so.
The thing I find so fascinating, and I apologize for my OG listeners because I say this all the time, but how much easier it has been to navigate what is actually for me versus what's just being marketed to me.
Yes.
Once I really figured out who I am and what I like and what I value. Where
Yes.
like 6 years ago, you could have sold me anything. You know what I mean? Like,
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
I'm an example of like, you could sell me a parka in Orlando, Florida. Like, I would be like, oh, well, I guess I need that, And so that's also why I think so much of this work, and I'm sure it's going to continue to expand as, we're quote unquote coming online to a lot of these things that we're experiencing in this age of, the digital age, but also just like the distraction age is the way that I really see it.
That's such a good term. I like that framing.
We're just so distracted where it's like, how can you even, people come to me and they feel bad and they, if it's like, oh, I've gotten so far away from myself or, being with me sometimes is the most quiet they've had. Where I'm like, so tell me why you're here. And I leave that space. And sometimes it takes a few minutes for somebody to get started. And I'm always surprised where I told my husband, I'm like, I didn't think people were going to be crying.
Yeah.
That was going to be, and not diminishing them. That's not at all what I need to do. But
no.
When we do give people a second to sit, how much shit, excuse my French, that we're all carrying.
Oh.
When you go back to those things of we disconnected from ourselves and vulnerability around 13. And so that's a lot when I talk about. Yeah.
I love you say this. I don't know if you ever catch yourself. I don't know if this ever happened to you or any listeners, but if you're like sitting, maybe you're waiting for something, but you're sitting and you just catch your thumb is moving or your hand is moving, or for a lot of people, their foot is moving. That jittery anxiousness, it's there for a reason. And I'm not saying it's a bad reason. I'm not saying it's just a signal to me when it happens to me that my mind's going. My mind is still racing, and like, that's okay. But if I'm trying to relax and if I'm really trying to just embrace just where I'm at, I mean, it's very hard to do that if your brain is just constantly going. And I do think a lot of that is it's some healthy self-reflection to be okay with, being with myself and being with my thoughts,
Yeah. And that's okay that's uncomfortable for us.
Yes.
I think that's so much of it. Like,
I agree.
Because again, we've created this world for ourselves that's constant distraction. And then everything is bigger, better, and bolder than you could ever be. So You have to buy into all of these things. And so then you're running so much trying to be these things that you're never going to be. And then you hate yourself. Then that comes the punishment. So then I'll buy the punishment thing. And that's like the biggest key that I teach people. I'm like, the shocking thing is like, you're the key. Like, you're the one that can tap out.
Yes.
It's you, dog. Like,
that's so good. That empowerment, I think, is so important. One of the things, so if you think about the implications of marketing in general, the idea is that you have to have something new. Because if you don't have something new, then it's not better. And if it's not better, why am I buying it? Why do I need it? Right. So the iPhone 15, and there's some cool research coming out on how people typically don't like high iterations of numbers. Like, we're really big on the iPhone 1 and the iPhone 2 and the iPhone 2 and the iPhone 3. But once it gets to 15, 16, and 17, we're over it. We want X's. We want, different. Yeah. But I think one of the main reasons this seems to be is that it just seems like it's incremental, that there's really not a significant, change happening. Now, one way to look at this is that, oh my gosh, we just have so many options. I don't even know what to choose. And I just don't want to get in something where I'm locked in and then I'm constantly feeling like I have to get the next. Another way of thinking about that, though, which by the way could be fully accurate. But another way to think about that is there's also just a lot of options that you get to customize for yourself. And so dieting is a great example of this for me and in the space that I work in and will talk with people about. Most people, I just don't know which one to choose. And the criteria that most people use, which is a logical criteria, is I want to choose the weight loss program that's going to give me the best results. So they're looking at efficacy. And what do? When we're looking for efficacy? We're going to poll, we're going to ask people, we're going to try to see what the general consensus is of what the best option is. The reality is, and I am making a big assumption, I'm assuming we're not talking about, these very eccentric diets. We're just still talking mainstream, diets. All of these options really give you a chance to, instead of focus on efficacy, focus on like personal fulfillment. Which one of these sort of fits with what you like to eat? What do you typically gravitate toward? What sounds like the eating plan that you'd actually enjoy? And we don't think about that, right? And a lot of the times we don't think about it because we anticipate it's going to be a struggle. And so almost the pain, concept again. But there's actually a lot of options and you can customize. It goes back to what you were saying. It's about you at the end of the day. And so even if there's this new this or this new this, it doesn't necessarily mean it's better. And even if it is better, it might not be better for you at the end of the day. And I think that can be a much healthier way of looking at some of these, sort of broader questions that we have, and goals and such. I did want to say something to you earlier. One of the things you had said earlier, I had it reminded me of something. I don't know if this has ever happened to you. This idea of like, are my preferences mine or are they essentially what I've been told to like, I've just been marketed to? Now, it's really hard to know this when everything converges, but I don't know if you've ever had this happen where you're watching something. I'll give an example of it used to be TV. Now we'll say like streaming or YouTube. We'll say YouTube. You're watching something on YouTube and then an ad pops up. And the ad is so not relevant to you. This will happen to me and I will get these these ads that are certainly targeted to like 80-plus-year-olds. And it's very, very specific to very specific physical changes and needs, right? And it makes me laugh because I know how much money marketers spend to make sure that they are positioning these ads to the right demographic. And so in my mind, I am just imagining it's me and a bunch of 80-year-olds watching this, right? But I also know at that point, wow, that is not me. But that is a way of thinking, well, I must really like this, right? Because clearly this isn't just a marketing tactic, but it is funny because it does happen to me. I don't know if that ever happened. You're like, no, you go to a movie and you look around, and you're like, nope, this is not targeted to me, but all right, I'm going to watch, like, let's go. It's kind of funny.
I love that so much. And I always, taking what you're saying and like on even like a zooming out even more than that, where I'm like, there are wonderful things about having the amount of choices, options, accessibility,
yes,
all those things that we have. So, when you begin to look at the world, people always joke like, isn't this in a simulation or like, are we in the Matrix? And I teach people where I'm like, yeah, man, pony up. If this is the buffet of what you get to choose, right?
Yeah.
Then make it a cornucopia of the shit that you want in your life. Because things are, you don't make the choice will be made for you. And I mean,
that's a great point, by the way.
And I mean that on like the smallest level where it's like, if you don't make the choice will be made for you. And then you're going to, wind up like me 6 years ago being like, what is all of this? And then
you're not alone in that, by the way. You're not alone in that.
Of course. And so, I think there's a lot of really awesome things about being marketed to you so specifically. I don't have to do as much like searching, if I've been talking about like, I'm like, oh, I need like new winter boots. I know I kind of want this and that. Great. 2 days later, an ad pops up and I'm like, awesome. There they are. So it's like there are things about it. Now, again, there goes into consumerism and everything, but I like to think I'm a fairly conscious consumer, probably of the average and moderate, right?
Right.
And so to me, I'm like, what a great thing. I didn't have to, get online and get a catalog and look through so there's a lot of really beautiful things. about the way in which this is happening. You know, there's been a lot in like worldly news with Israel and Palestine recently, and like that's very overwhelming to see on our phones all the time. Yes, take breaks. On the other side, how amazing that we live in a time where we're able to like all experience something, pinpoint, know what's happening, getting up to date. Like there's got to be good and bad about everything, and that's something I harp on a lot when I'm talking, and I just make it into jokes so people don't feel like I'm preaching at them. But, you know, where I'm like, everybody's like, the world is ending. The world is ending. I'm like, y'all, the world has been ending since the beginning. You know, I'm like, let me walk you back through every major disaster and tragedy and humanitarian. You know, I'm like, we enslaved people for thousands of years.
Right.
So just because we're canceling people and, you know, like this, it's like, yeah, we're still fucked up because we're not working on anything. But not saying that the world is. Anyway, I'll put my soapbox away. Thank you.
No, but it's true. And the point you made, I think, is a really important point. That the choice is going to be made for us. And if you think, and I use dieting just because it's something that people talk to me a lot about. You could do this with finances. You could do it with any major goal. But here's the reality. We all have a default. And if you think that default is just there randomly, that's not the case. So if you look at what, you know, again, what you're currently spending, let's talk about finances. There's part of that's been programmed into us, and it may be programmed through, you know, obviously socially we've been taught certain things, how we were brought up. These are all very important things as well. There are biological markers for a lot of these things. But the point is that if we don't think we're going to make a choice, the choice will get made for us. The example I give in this, it's a bit tongue in cheek, but is if you're going to go out to dinner with 4 friends, and if they say, where do you want to go? You saying, well, I don't care, that is a choice because that decision will get made, and you just have to be okay with that. So, you know, if you, and we usually see it where it's funny, right? We have these preferences by exclusion. So people might be like, well, I don't really care, just not, you know, whatever, certain food, right? You know, but it's like, well, just make sure you say that, because if the decision is going to get made, and if you delegate it or defer it, you just want to know who you're delegating and defer it to. It is important.
Yeah, I love that so much. And there's 2 things that come to mind. One, when you talk about products always having to be like new and different, I have a joke about that where I'm like, you know, if toothpaste can continue to reinvent itself, so can you. You know, I'm like, there's no way I've been brushing my teeth for 37 years. And the product I'm using now, I'm like, well, what was I brushing my teeth with? You know,
nothing a day.
What dog shit did I have in my mouth? You know,
exactly.
It's the same thing where I'm like, feel free to reinvent yourself. We live in a world that is constantly selling us the same thing and, you know, putting some rouge on it and telling us that we're getting something else. So people are so scared to kind of take and be courageous and do something different. And, you know, where I'm like, really, it's not that serious, you know? And then the other thing, talk about these default choices. I also like to remind people when people get very unhappy in relationships and marriages and things like that, more so romantic relationships and friendships. But we have 2 things, which is we live in a world where most of our products are disposable. So we then attach that to relationships. Well, I'll find something bigger, better, and greater because I'm surrounded by, you know, so that's the, I'm working on a stand-up show right now called We Interrupt Your Programming. And it's exactly that.
I love it.
All of these, because I was so excited to have this conversation with you. We're like that, the idea of like something that being disposable or fast fashion or like anything. I ended up at a hotel and I forgot this thing. It's fine. Amazon will deliver it in 18 hours. So I'm unhappy with this one thing that my spouse does. Well, I'll just unload them. I'll get someone else.
I'll get someone else that won't. Yep.
Yeah. So there's a lot of things we really have to be mindful of.
So, there's a really fascinating fallacy that happens when we do this and we consider these alternatives that you might find sort of interesting. I don't know if it's been studied in relationships, but it certainly has been studied in things like home purchases. And so I apologize if I am making a really inappropriate extension, but I feel like the process might actually, psychologically, the processes should be the same. So here's what happened. Here's what typically happens. If we take a home, right? And we say, oh, well, you know, my current home, it doesn't have this, it doesn't have this, it doesn't have this. So we got these 3 things that my current home doesn't have. So what do? Well, we go to find a new place that has these 3 things. The problem with that is that we're forgetting that our home has all of these other things that we love. It may have 40 things that we love and only 3 things we really struggle with. Now you move somewhere else and that may address those 3 things, but now you don't have several of these other things that you have. So guess what? You're just going to be unhappy on a different dimension. And I don't mean just unfulfilled, right? And it's the process is you're never going to check all the boxes. Like that's hopeless. Like at the end of the day, the problem is when you have the readily available alternative. I can wear some, I've been running lately, and I've been taking these, I've been trying different energy, like chew things, right? If one doesn't work or sit well, I'll just buy another. It's very easy to do that. In some instances, sure, that may be adaptable and actually can be pretty positive. But in other instances, especially things where we talk about anything related to commitment of any kind, that's horrible. Like it is horrible because it doesn't make any sense. It's not realistic. Like it's not going to be that realistic. Yeah. Also, good luck trying to find that, right? Like it's going to check all the boxes. It doesn't.
But I think 2 things that I think of from your share. One, which is like, to me, that becomes like what I call the cat in the hat. If you recall from the cat in the hat, yes. There's a stain on and so, okay, well then we'll take it and then we'll put it in the back.
That's it. Yes.
You have to put it on the curtains. So I'm like,
it's so good.
The fulfillment that you're looking for is in the stain that's on the curtains. Like you think that if you move to a house that has a center island and then you have double sinks, that like then your childhood trauma is going to be okay. Like I need to let you know, the fulfillment that you're looking for is not in the $9 soap that you're buying. Like that's just how it works.
No, that's good. It's a good distinction between essentially fixing and coping. Yes. And that we can conflate those 2 so much. And what I would say is retail therapy is a real thing. But it's a coping strategy. And as long as you're aware that it's a coping strategy, then you can at least monitor it and know what you're doing and, you're aware of it. But it's when you conflate the 2 that it starts to become problematic. When you think, oh, well, this is going to fix it. It's like, well, no, it's not going to fix the issue. Yeah.
Well, any short-term, anything that we reach for to fix something that's an overall ache, that reach will never, that's just like the cosmic law of all of it. Like, it's just never going to fix it. I tell people that all the time. I'm like, if a glass of, whiskey on the rocks would have fixed it, like I'd be a lot further along by now. Like that's just not how it goes. The thing what you eat at dinner time is not going to make tomorrow. Like all of these things that we do, buying those Gucci boots that you can't afford, or like cheating on your wife because it made like any of these things that we do, gambling, all of the things, and scrolling, putting ourselves out to be seen so that you don't really see what's going on with me.
Exactly.
It's just that attempt and something that I teach a lot and mostly say to myself so I remember is the harmony lies between that discord of what can I do that the majority of my boxes are filled, that the majority of what's happening I feel good about, I feel secure, and I feel at peace. My nervous system is calm and I'm in a routine that makes me feel fulfilled, while knowing the harmony exists of like the things that maybe you haven't achieved yet, or the things that you're not really ready to work on yet, or whatever, like having the balance and harmony between those 2. And that, at least for me, that practice, and I say practice very literally, I would say has decreased like 25% of daily anxiety, because I'm like, you know what? I got 2 kids, I got podcasts, I got things to do. If the dishes sit till 8:30, what am I going to all day be like, the dishes are sitting, you big dumb idiot. Oh, you would be a better mom if you could. That helps nothing. The dishes are going to sit there. And later, we're going to keep it moving.
Yep. Breathe and move on. Breathe and move on. I think that's a really good perspective. And I do think that in goal pursuit, we distinguish between 2 types of feedback that people typically want, but it also can work for what we give back to people. And so one type we'll just call, it's psychology, so the language is always a little funky, but one is hedonic feedback. And the other is, we'll just call it utilitarian feedback. And so, for instance, let's say you failed an exam. and you're a student and you come talk to me. Well, I could give that student a bunch of different pieces of advice, or I could talk to them, but they're probably going to fall, most of it is going to fall into one of these two categories. So hedonic might be something like, hey, it's okay. You know, this grade was poor, but you've got plenty of other opportunities. Basically they're at a low, they want to feel better, right? And so they want feedback that's going to help them feel better. On the flip side, you can also tell them, well, here's why you did that. Here's why you did poorly. You know, you didn't study very well. You know, you clearly didn't, you didn't attend classes, right? Et cetera, et cetera. Now, that is really beneficial because that can help them learn from their mistakes so that when they do this again, it hopefully won't repeat. But there has to be a match. Like the person has to be receptive to wanting the type of feedback you're actually going to give them. And it turns out that people do want utilitarian feedback, but just at certain times. They don't always want it. And the same thing with sort of this hedonic feedback. And what's interesting is when you talk about, let's say, relationships, or even just in the consumerism domain, and this idea of lacking, conflict is how we grow. And if we had everything that fit everything that we wanted all the time, our lives would be boring and we would be bored. We had talked earlier about vulnerabilities. And one of the fascinating aspects is when there is a point of conflict, when one of those boxes isn't unchecked, that's where the spice of the relationship can come from. That's where there is a ton of potential and progress to be able to grow. And there's also an element of some like really healthy, like honesty to be like, you know what? This bothers me, but it's about this person. I don't know if you can get any more vulnerable than that, right? Like me sharing something that I know the other person's not going to like, but they like it anyway. There's a lot of growth that can come from that. And I know that's idyllic, but just again, going back to reframing some of these things as instead of it happening to necessarily be something that's lacking, it might not be, it might be an opportunity or a potential. And at least you're aware of it. I mean, that's part of it as well. You know, I mean, if the dishes bother you, cover them with a towel and then get to them later at night. You just don't have to see it. I mean, you know, but at least you know, right?
I love that. I love that so much. But you know why I love that is that it's action based, so you get to feel like you did something. I know that I think you were just being silly, but now I'm like,
no.
It's actually a really good idea. Where it's the action of something. So okay, I did what I could do about it now. And then that also feels like in that same way of like reaching for something. So it feels like in a way of like, I've been able to scratch that itch immediately without, you know, because we talk about that, like breathe and move on. And it's so hard. And I see it. And I've a 2-year-old and already seeing some of those Rachel LaForce traits. And I'm like, oh gosh, here's an opportunity to really just work these out of our DNA. And, you know, so it's funny where, you know, again, where it's like, if you don't choose, the world will choose for you.
Yes.
Very, as I identify them, universal or cosmic lessons that you're trying to avoid, that they will find their way back to you.
One thing that there's a really powerful effect. Again, the labeling is not great. It's inhibitory versus initiatory goals, but it hits on this. And I'm going to fixate on the dishes, just if that's okay, just for a minute. Because I also think that's something that is very relatable to a lot of people as well. What's not going to help that situation is something that's inhibitory, meaning it's a goal that focuses on negation. So in this case, it would be just don't think about it, right? Don't think about the dishwasher. Don't think about the dishes, or don't think about it. Problem is, we don't do that very well. And not only that, like our brains aren't really programmed to do that very well. Like the classic example is if I say, don't think about a white bear, what pops into your head, right? A white bear. The idea that, you know, like, hey, just go to sleep, like stop thinking. It's like, it doesn't work that way. Right. And so the idea of just breathing, if you can do that in the sense of like, I'm going to distract and move on, then wonderful. But if you're just going to perseverate on it, well, that's not going to be healthy. On the flip side, so do something that's initiatory is the idea. Do something that's action-based. And again, this is the idea of, I mean, honestly, sometimes what even helps in these types of moments is earmarking and literally saying, you know what? This is a problem I am going to resolve. I'm just going to delegate that resolution to 8:30 tonight.
Yep.
And then in your brain, you can move on because your brain you have closure. You know you're going to get it done. You've essentially done all of the working in terms of the mental movement, right? And the idea, though, is that you're doing something to help yourself, because the idea is if you're feeling anxious about something, it is important to try to understand why and what triggers that anxiety, because that's going to help you be more aware of it and all of us be more aware of it as we're going forward. But then there is also the idea of coping with it and dealing with it, right? And part of that is if you can do something as opposed to not doing something, right? So, and by the way this might be practical for a lot of people is you can say things like, I want to spend less and this month. And that's good. But again, that is more inhibitory. You want something initiatory. So in other words, I'm only going to spend $40 on this and $80 on whatever, right? Like go through your budget or whatnot. Give yourself proactive goals that you can go for. Those are the types of strategies that are going to be more effective in the long run. One of my like I think is really powerful is people who want to quit smoking. It is very difficult to quit smoking simply because it's also just very ignoring all the chemical and biological effects that happen physically as well. It's just very hard to quit anything that we do that is a really strong habit. What you can do is you can start a goal that is competing with something like smoking. So, and you will find most of running is a really, really great counteractive goal, because there's a lot of things you really can't do when you're running, and running is very, very positive for, respiratory health, for instance. You start building back a lot of the, I don't know if you can reverse all of it, but you can certainly reverse some of the impact of smoking. And the other thing too is it's very hard to smoke and run. Like it's just very hard to do practically. But this idea of initiating and doing something, I think it's a way of fighting a bit of that programming, because the anxiety is there. And the idea, and we kind of were talking about this a little bit earlier, but it's okay that you feel anxiety. I don't think that's the issue. That's what we want to focus on, but I don't know if that's the issue as much as there is an element of just self-acceptance, but then trying to turn that into some sort of positive or some sort of proactive solution to deal with it. Because I do think it can be really limiting, or I think it certainly can. I know it can be in my life.
Yeah, I mean, and I think a lot of times, again, I'm not talking about anxiety disorders.
No, me neither. Sorry, me neither as well. Right, yes. Thank you.
But even I think our daily anxiety, I'm very mindful of mine, but I know even within my social circle, I'll be shocked sometimes how much friends of mine, family of mine, how much anxiety they're really carrying to a level where like it's not debilitating for them, but it's certainly not helping. Right. And a lot of things I always find is I'm like, it's just unused energy. So a lot of times when we get anxious, the feeling is like, I'm going to turn off everything and I just want to, it's like when really it's the opposite. I'm like, you need to go run. It's not like actually like running, right? It's like, but it's like, right. You need to get outside. You need to take your shoes off. You need to go stand outside. You need to stretch. You need to breathe. It's all of that tension. So the more that we're kind of like keeping this here, or I'm like, you need to just write that email. It's like you have a month now worth of anxiety because you didn't want to tell somebody you're passing up on a job, and now you have a month, where. And
that's
that again,
a great example.
It's choice now or choice later. My mom used to say this. She's like, pain now or pain later.
Exactly. Yep. Exactly.
And I think in what you were talking about of the like action based stuff and why that's more. I think something we can like stay with long term, right? Because again, it feels like something we can do.
That's it.
Animals want to know that we're in control. And so especially if you're letting go of something, like a lot of times if I'm talking with women and they just went through a big like breakup or divorce, or they're wanting to change relationship patterns, I'm like, you can write it down every day. Like you thought you weren't going to make it through the day of like texting that person back and you made it through. You can write day 1, day 2, day 3. Like any of those small things, like that was the thing for me when I quit smoking. Well, my joke is always that I finally got so angry. Like anger was the only thing that got me to quit. Like it's where I was in my life. Like I was losing everything. The last cigarette I ever smoked, I remember I was so angry. I just quit drinking. I had like just all these things were falling away in my life. It was just what I was experiencing. And I remember looking at the cigarette and I was like, well, I guess I don't need this anymore. And I never slipped again. It's so funny to me where, and that's not to say that everything was easy, but like I was just at that pinnacle point where I was like, all right, if I'm like going to lose everything, then I'm losing everything. But for me, it was money where, you know, packs of cigarettes are $13. That's a lot of money. You're smoking a pack a day or a pack, you know, however. So that was fun for me where I was like, oh, you can actually see this, you know, I was broke in LA. So I'm like, oh, cool.
Oh, yeah.
$100 now, you know?
No, but what's great about that, and that's a wonderful example too. I mean, that's why initiatory goals work so well. The action, because it gives you a clear path forward. It's not that the opposite can't happen. It's just that it's inherent in an action-based goal. Like it just, the only way you define it is by an action and is by something you can do. We just had a paper on this idea of control and sort of this idea of at least perceived control. It is very, very powerful. We just had a paper accepted on the idea is this idea. It's about goals, and I think this is it. It's been about a 10-year project, but we finally got it out. I think it's a really fascinating project. It's on this idea, we call it goal paralysis. It's this idea that that there are times where we just feel like we can't pursue our goals at all. And what happens is we then reduce our effort investment toward them, and we just don't engage in it anymore. And one of the what we focus on in this one paper is the perception of either having bad luck or being unlucky. Mm-hmm. And what we were finding, which I just think is psychologically fascinating, is that people who, for instance, felt like they were just having a bad day and that everything was stacked against them that day. So it might have been something where they caught a lot of red lights going into work, right? These types of it was raining a lot and they didn't have their umbrella. But these things that they were interpreting as essentially signs that they were just unlucky or they just had bad luck that day. These were individuals who were then less likely to stick to whatever their goals are. So for instance, they weren't going to work out that day. They were more likely to, eat whatever foods they wanted to eat, et cetera, et cetera. And the reason I love this is because I can relate to that. So many of us, I think, can relate to that feeling. But what's interesting is that it really comes down to the fact that the predictor and the cause of all of this is really in our own heads. Mm-hmm. Because what happens is once we start feeling unlucky, we feel like we're not in control. And then if we don't feel like we're in control, well, what's the point of putting forth effort? And there are instances where that is true. And again, you mentioned earlier, there are also addictions that are very, very serious. And so we have to take all of that into account. But I'm talking about just sort of more of the day-to-day struggles that we face. The perception of control, we call it in the field, we call it self-efficacy, is very, very powerful in sort of determining our sort of success going forward, especially long term.
Yeah. No, I love that so much because it, like, again, there's a couple things. So many thoughts at once. That's something going back when you talk about self-efficacy. I mean, sometimes things happen to us, right? And like that's the place we find ourselves in life. Yeah. A lot of times, again, going back to that like 13-year-old self, where we learned to shut off all the things that made us unique. So I always find when people say something to me, typically something negative or not uplifting, right? If we had a negative side and good side, whatever, going back and forth, whenever they're ending up in one category that we would deem more negative, I always ask, who's talking? And again, these things seem woo-woo, but I'm like, who's talking? Is that 37-year-old Rachel who's built 2 businesses and has a kid and is quit drinking and helped all these people? Is that does 37-year-old Rachel think that she's not valuable enough, or does 13-year-old Rachel say that?
Yes.
And I found it's funny because if you are courageous enough and love yourself enough and give yourself the time to get to the place where you have this, like, wherever you are, where you are right now, where you love yourself and it doesn't mean that every day I'm like, I'm awesome, but meaning where I'm like value and I feel like I'm in alignment and I'm curious and I'm excited about my life, right? You then have this interesting thing where I always talk about people, I'm like, typically, heavy trauma aside, 8 years old is when you were like the most kind of like fun, creative, like you were able to do stuff kind of on your own. Maybe you have some memories of like more 90s kids of like doing something on your own without your parents,
Oh, yeah.
And so that voice is always like, oh yeah, we're going to try it. Oh, we're going to get into that thing. And so then you have two voices that are saying you can do it. And you just have the 13-year-old that needs a little bit more support. So I like to ask people that, because a lot of times that I'm unlucky or other people get things, a lot of that, if I ask you enough questions, that's going to lead me back to somewhere around that time where you weren't invited or somebody said something, you were embarrassed in front of everybody, like whatever that traumatizing event was, where you heard loud and clear, you are not good enough.
Good enough, yep.
Like you need to hide, or whatever that,
yes.
that messaging was that you received. And I think that's why I always tell people, where I'm like, sure, you can deem this work woo-woo. You can deem this work, whatever you'd like, soft, whatever. I'm like, then you're the one that gets to live at the level that you've decided.
Exactly.
Or you can get over yourself and you can spend a little time and go, yeah, that was really painful and that sucked. And I've taken that with me for 20 years and I'm done. Like, you decide.
What's really, so I love that, because I do love that when you're able to sort of label experiences, or label, like you said, literally voices, we have thoughts. They're not always up to our own control. And I'll give you a great example of this. I don't know this literature super well, but I'm fascinated by it. It's this idea of intrusive thoughts. Yep. So you get these very negative thoughts, and you're like, I didn't come up with that. It just popped into my head. And me being me, of course, I'm then figuring out where that came from and why, because that's what I'm interested in, right? But what I love is disassociating that from that thought from me. Like, just because it popped into my head doesn't mean that it's me. And I think what's really, really interesting is that we go through things in life, and it's okay to license ourselves, essentially, sort of the language, I guess, that we use in our literature, to license ourselves to have felt that way when we went through it. When we were 13, and it was very formative, and we had the experiences that we had, those were valid feelings at that time. You don't have to critique your 13-year-old self. I don't have to critique my 13-year-old self, because at the end of the day, at the time, that was the best I could do, whatever it might have been. And that voice is still with all of us, I'm sure, in different ways. But being able to label it, I can still sort of value what was happening at that time. But I'm a different person now. I'm not that 13-year-old. And also, just because that happened first doesn't necessarily mean it's the most impactful thing that's happened to me. Kind of what you were saying. Look at all these things that you've been able to do. I have other voices that I need to be. There are other experiences in my life that I also need to be hearing from, so to speak. But being able to label that, I think, is so important.
I love what you just said, of that there are other things that have happened in my life that I need to pay attention to. And that's a psychology thing, right? Like,
very much so.
People in forward-facing spaces talk about that all the time. I could have a million write-ups about how phenomenal my show was, and then one person's like, I didn't think that chick was funny. And I'm like, I can't believe they would say that.
You're crying. I know. That's teacher evaluations for me. That's teacher evaluations. You're like, what am I doing? But
of course. And so, all of this, where it's interesting, because it all goes back to where it's like, when we recognize that we are the ones in the driver's seat, all of these kind of choices become options rather than overwhelming. Whether it's dieting, it's relationship, or I don't want to say dieting, lifestyle, relationship. Right. Like, even in the rituals or spiritual modalities I offer people, and I work with people that are going through something similar in their life, but I work with vastly different people.
Yes.
And so here are things that have worked for me. You may find some that work for you, right? And so I try to work to have different options that would suit different people. Because if it's not, like you said, even about food or exercise, if it's not something that's going to click with you, then you're not going to do it. So also, I ask people, like, you need to be honest with me if you're like, yeah, none of those are for me. Like, I'm like, I have other people at my resource that I can be like, hey, this person, is a night owl, or whatever, kind of give them a synopsis and be able to find and facilitate things that you will actually implement. But I think that's so much of this, like I said, where it's like, we as individuals are the key to being able to navigate all of this. And there are going to be times where it's certainly overwhelming. I have felt the overwhelm immensely over the last 2 weeks. I mean, immensely. Very high highs, very low lows, like a world that feels overwhelming, you know, and then the holidays are coming up. And now, you know, I went to Whole Foods. There was already like, here's all the things you have to have, because if you're a good hostess, you have to have all of these things. It's like, we don't need 7 different types of apple cider. Regular apple cider, you already get and nobody drinks it. You know what I mean?
No one drinks it anyway. Right.
I don't need to get mint apple cider to throw it away for me. Like, I don't.
Exactly.
And so I appreciate your work so much, and I really just appreciate even being able to like have this conversation and connect with you and hear the work that you're doing. So tell us, if you are interested, as we kind of bring this conversation for a landing, what's kind of like next for your work? What are you working on? Where like the spaces you kind of want to take this stuff?
So, yeah, and I have to say this has just been really, really fun. I've enjoyed this. The relevance of this work, I think, is one of the reasons that these are they're fun topics, but they're also important topics, and I enjoy being able to have them at this type of level, because I think it is because you impact people, and I think that that's something that can easily be lost in sort of the ivory tower of just working on research and publishing. The new stuff that I'm doing is sort of counterintuitive. So I a few years ago, I worked on a book that basically it's real short. It's 8 chapters. It's all about self-control. And it literally was just, I was looking for a book I'll get books for people for gifts at Christmas and different things. And I was looking for a self-control book that was research oriented, for my dad. I thought he would actually like it. And I was just struggling to find one that I really liked. And so I was like, well, you know what? I'm going to write one that essentially would be like, if you had a goal, you could just start from chapter 1 and go through chapter 7 or 8. The last one's on maintenance. So essentially the first 7, and you at least would know, you'd have way more information than you wanted, but at least you could kind of go through something through the full steps, and hopefully it would set you up for success. And upon that, one of the big things that we talk about is this idea of having attainable goals. You want realistic goals. And to be very clear, yes, you do 100% of the time. That being said, I've been in this really fun space lately. You were talking about sort of one way I would label the way you were talking to some of your clients and people you work with is you're very intuitive. So this is what works for me. This is what has worked for other people, but let me try to connect with you on that. But in that is something that's kind of healthy with is that may not connect with you, and that's okay. I can do the same thing with research ideas. And I have been fascinated with this idea of setting extreme and probably even, this is very, very new stuff, but unattainable goals. So for instance, I had a buddy, we ran I'm not a runner. I am not a runner at all. I do not like running. But 10 months ago, I tried to run like a mile. I was struggling so bad. I couldn't do it. And it just bothered me. I was like, come on, dude. I remember being a kid, and I got these nieces and nephews. I'm like, I gotta improve this. And so I trained, and I trained for a 15K, and I ran it. And then a buddy of mine was like, oh, well, why don't you train for a 50K? And I'm like, a 50K, dude, what are you talking about? And that was like, it's insane, right? And at the same time as my buddy was trying to talk me into that, I had another buddy who just told me that he was like, yeah, and I just signed up for an Ironman. And I'm like, dude, you own a bike? Like it was really this thing. And one of the conversations that we had, so my buddy talked me into doing the 50K. It's funny, I actually do it in 10 days. So I'll have to let you know how I do. But yeah. It was 6 months away at the time when we committed to it. And it was extreme. Like there's just no way that this is something that I would actually be able to do. But there were some benefits to that, right? There's benefits and things like, for instance, you have to prioritize yourself in some ways. You have to prioritize self-care. It takes an abstract goal, and you can't focus on the outcome because in all likelihood, the outcome is going to be failure. So you have to focus on the process. You have to focus on just enjoying the moments. You have to break it down into concrete steps. And so whether or not I succeed or not, I mean, I have run so much more. And if I think back to what I was doing 10 months ago, that I couldn't even run a mile, it's pretty remarkable, right? And so anyway, it's a fun conceptual space for me because of this idea that there might be some unintended or benefits to setting, really pushing yourself almost so extreme that you have to reprioritize your life. Because that's one of the big things that I see when we were talking earlier about change and how hard it can be to sort of change and to quit. And in your instance, it's almost appropriate or fitting when you were saying with, you know what, I'm making all these other changes to my life. You know what, I guess I don't need you as well, right? Like, because most of us, when we go to set goals, we set our New Year's resolutions, they're typically within the confines of our existing life. And the difficulties of that are, well, if we want to make a major change, it's going to affect our existing, daily lives and our structures as well. And so you're going to have to shake things up. And so this has been sort of a fun, sort of just personal space that I've been moving into as well. And yeah, so that's going to be something that's going to move forward. Like I said, we're in the self-improvement domain. It's been really fascinating as well. So, yeah, it's great, especially when you think about how people market these things, marketing pain, marketing discomfort, marketing health and wellness, and really trying to get to some of the understanding of what are some of the ways that we should at least be doing this, and or at least we can let people know this is why these are effective. So at least you have an awareness of what's drawing you to it, right? But yeah, so that's what I've been doing lately, and that's what I'm hoping to be doing, the next few months.
I love it. I love it so much. And it's funny because as you're talking about unattainable goals, I'm like, oh, you mean like my goal of this becoming the #1 crossover podcast for common spirituality? Like,
there you go.
When I talk that with a straight face and they're like, oh, you mean the one you do out of your home? I'm like, yeah, the one I do out of my home, because to me, I also feel like, I also think this would be interesting to that I'll read about in your book. I'm happy to write the foreword. Thank you so much for asking.
Good, yeah.
But having the foundation of like true commitment, and you also have to kind of clear the deck. Like, you're not going to be able to get, like, I see in LA all the time where there's comics who are completely broke, like living out of their car, and they have these completely unattainable dreams. I'm like, you can't even get to the gig.
Right.
Like that, that's something that's unattainable in the way of like, that's not healthy. And we need to get, I don't
100%.
But as the example of like, we need to construct other things in your life to get you in a foundational place.
Exactly.
You can incrementally go to these unattainable goals, right?
Exactly.
Like, oh, you're going to do an Ironman. Like, you don't even know how to be on a bike, like there's those things. Right. And so I feel that way where like, I tell people all the time, 6 years ago, I had a spiritual awakening in a bunk bed in Aspen, and I'm like, I'm going to change my life. Well, I wouldn't have done it if I knew that just getting to this point was going to take me 6 years. Like,
exactly.
I never would have done it.
Exactly.
Hold on. The work I really want to do, I don't even get to really start doing for 6 years from now. And then people still don't really know I'm doing it yet. Like, no thanks, bro. So I think, but again,
that's the idea. That is the idea.
Change my life. And all of the different things that happened, like, I didn't think at that point that I was going to meet my husband, have 2 kids, and buy my childhood home. Like, did not think that was going to be in the cards. And so I think that, there's a lot of richness there in that topic.
Yes.
And then also, me thinking from like a social media strategy, having anything that says something about unattainable goals is just so much clickbait that I'm like, oh, that's
I know.
Skyrocket. So I wish you nothing but continued and curiosity and all of those things. So I'm just so grateful for the conversation. I had really been looking forward to this. And it was just so fun. So we'll plug you in all of the places. Is there anything else that you would like to let us know where we can find you? Is there somewhere where all of your articles are placed, or anything like on your website, any of that good stuff?
Yeah, just my website. I got rid of social media a couple years ago. A personal choice. It was just not the healthiest for me. It kind of everything we just talked about. That's why. But no, my website is joshuaclarkson.com. All my articles are there. There's ways to get in touch with me through there. If anyone ever has any questions, please reach out. And this has been absolutely fascinating. I've enjoyed it as well. Thank you so much, Rachel. Thank you for having me. And I really do appreciate it to all your listeners as well. Thank you all.
Did I tell you or did I tell you? Okay. Yeah. Slam dunk. You guys need to go to his website now. I'm like, I want to read some of those papers. I think there's so much. I know I'm going to circle back to this episode just to kind of be able to read the transcript and look at some of this stuff and how can I like talk more about these concepts and ideas. Just such, just food for thought in this episode. So, I mean, the fact that we went from like cults to like the Iron Man, I mean, we just like really, we did it. So thank you guys so much for listening. If you're in the Atlanta area in November and December, I have a bunch of upcoming shows, so check the show notes for that. I have the Holiday Soul Salon that's going to be happening at Phoenix and Dragon Bookstore in Sandy Springs. There's 2 dates in November, 2 in December. You can go to rachellaforce.com for all the details and snag your tickets. So it's all going to be a journey of self-exploration. There's all sorts of different spiritual modalities and also just like communion and fun. So please, the communion of being together. We're not actually going to take communion, although if we do, these events are going to get real wild. You know what I mean? So I've got that. And then also coming up on November 18th, I have a full stand-up show that I'm doing at Utility Works alongside a bunch of other very funny moms who happen to be comedians or comedians who happen to be moms. I don't know which way you frame it, but that I've got going on. So all of that, the ticket information, all that and more, you can go to my Instagram and snag all of that from the link in bio. And you can also go to rachellaforce.com. Live shows and all of those will be available right there. If you guys know what to do. Do you like this show? Can you tell somebody about it? I know exactly how many reviews I have. 270. Can you be 271? I know you're like, that's my magic number. Okay, get on it. Get out there. Leave me a review. I'd be so, so grateful. If you're on the YouTubes, even if you're not, head over to the Rachel LaForce. Hit that subscribe button. I have so much content that's on there. So much, in fact, that each time I go, I'm like, wow, I'm really talking a lot. This is a lot. So if you're really liking these practices and kind of being able to learn from me and with me, definitely want to check out YouTube. There's so many amazing resources there. And that's it. That's all I got. I'm hyped up. This was so much fun. I'm so glad that you're here. I'm so excited for what lies ahead. Ugh, there's so much to do. I'm so excited. All right, tune out, tune in. Love you, mean it.
Time, weather, and always pass.